Now, the return of Emperor Palpatine in the sequels was one of the more controversial decisions those films made, as well as being one of the most often mocked or ridiculed ones, mainly because of the way it was handled or the explanation that was given or not given right in the film, right in The Rise of Skywalker, when Poe Dameron said this now infamous line.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
But as a lot of you out there know, there was another time that Palpatine had come back from the dead, this one taking place in the expanded universe, back in the early days of it, or early days of the EU from my point of view at least, considering I consider the start of it to also be my start into it, which was reading Heir to the Empire back in May of 1991 when I was 13 years old, an experience I did a whole video on a while back now. And, interestingly enough, perhaps, Palpatine's return was going to be my second experience or journey into the expanded universe, one that took place while patiently waiting for the second book in the Thrawn trilogy to come out, and it'd also be the first one to ever be given to us by Dark Horse Comics back in December of 1991, this happening after Marvel stopped the mainline Star Wars comic books in 1986 and the Droids and Ewok comics in 1987, due to Star Wars starting to fade from the spotlight. The late 80s, as I've discussed before, it was kind of a dark time for Star Wars and its fans, and if it wasn't for Heir to the Empire, who knows where I would be today. But anyway, it was then in December of 1991 that I essentially stumbled upon this new Star Wars comic book from Dark Horse, a company I knew virtually nothing about at the time other than they existed and made comics, and with no idea that such a comic book was even coming out in the first place. Keeping in mind this was very much a pre-internet world, and though I was into comics back then, mainly reading Uncanny X-Men and a few other Marvel titles, I was by no means an expert and more or less just picked up what I wanted to pick up and read from a local sports card shop that had a comic book rack tucked into the back corner. And one afternoon after school, I went in there and found a Star Wars comic called Dark Empire with Luke Skywalker rather prominent on the cover wielding his green lightsaber, and I grew rather excited to say the least, until I saw the $2.95 price tag, which was a lot more than the $1 or $1.25 comics usually were back then, and my heart kind of sank because I couldn't afford it. I didn't have $3 to my name, and I'd have to wait until I got my whole $5 allowance on Friday to buy it. But long story short, Friday came, and I did indeed get the comic after school, and I went home and read it. And rather recently, partly because I've tended to be less than satisfied with Disney-era Star Wars, though sure, there's been some good stuff here and there that I have enjoyed, don't get me wrong, but partly because of bad Disney Star Wars, and partly because there are a lot of EU stories that I read literally decades ago now, and honestly I don't remember so well, or that slipped through the cracks and I never read at all. Anyway, because of that, I've decided to go back to the beginning and to reread or relive it all over again, in a way, or as much of it as I have time to do, because yes, there are a lot of books and comics that have come out over the years. And considering, as I mentioned, that I reread Heir to the Empire again not all too long ago, maybe about a year or two ago, I figured I'd start with, as I said, my second ever experience with the EU, that being Dark Empire. And considering how often I get people asking me to talk much more about the EU, I really don't talk much about it at all because, well, as I've mentioned before, a lot of channels do cover it or have covered it, so I've wanted to find maybe a more unique approach to talking about it, which hopefully this will be and will interest people. But anyway, I figured I'd share this adventure with, well, anyone who is interested in going on it with me. And so what follows will be part trip down memory lane, part a comparison to Palpatine's return in the sequels, and part just discussing Dark Empire in and of itself, or at least the first 2 issues of it. If people do indeed enjoy this video, I'll finish up not only the other 4 issues in the series, but the other parts of the Dark Empire saga. And we'll then go from there in terms of if I'll keep doing videos like this or not. And so to begin here, what you first have to keep in mind about Dark Empire is that this comic came out long before the prequels did, meaning, of course, there are things that won't, shall we say, align with that story so well, if at all. Though it should also be noted that a rule Lucas basically had for the early days of the EU was that it really wasn't supposed to deal with that whole time period, the prequel time period, since he already knew he was going to be making those films. Also keep in mind or remember that back then, my knowledge of Star Wars came exclusively from the original trilogy, from watching it way too many times, as well as from Heir to the Empire, which I'd read a few months before this comic book came out and that I sort of considered gospel at this point in time. That was as much Star Wars to me as Lucas's original films. I don't think I even fully comprehended, despite Timothy Zahn's name obviously being on the cover of the book, that he, Lucas, didn't write it himself. Or maybe I just wanted to believe it came straight from the mind of the creator of Star Wars. Anyway, the opening page of Dark Empire's first issue gives us what was essentially an opening crawl and tells us that we're now 10 years after the Battle of Endor, which I remember back in the day finding rather curious or odd, if not almost a little concerning in a way, considering Heir to the Empire took place 5 years after the Battle of Endor, and thus we were moving quite a bit ahead of that. And I had no idea if this comic was in some way a part of that story, a direct continuation of it even, or if it was just its own thing, keeping in mind that again, I went into this 100% blind, not even knowing this was going to be a thing, much less knowing that this was going to lead to the return of Palpatine. I even wondered if the next book in the Thrawn trilogy, which I didn't think of as the Thrawn trilogy back then, but rather the sequels to Return of the Jedi, which I still kind of think of them as, but I wondered if maybe that next book would take place after this comic book or series was. Because why else would we get a story that takes place so far ahead of it? And I kind of thought that must be the case, that this was the next part of the Thrawn trilogy in a way, when it mentioned, again in that opening crawl, that many worlds had been taken by a resurgent empire, including Coruscant, which we'd first seen in the Thrawn trilogy, and back then it had been in the hands of the good guys. Again, it felt like this was kind of spoiling stuff, or had to be a continuation. We then learned that there was a raid on Coruscant, led by Luke and Lando, trying to accomplish who knows what exactly, but that something had gone wrong and left them stranded there, but that help was on the way. And that help was Han, Leia, Chewie, and 3PO in the Millennium Falcon, along with 2 other Rebellion frigates, one of which crashes right away. And right in these first few pages we learn that there is a civil war now within the Empire, that there are those who are loyal to Palpatine's ways, and those who are not, and that they've been fighting for a while apparently. Coruscant and other planets are even being decimated by this war, and I gotta say, seeing Coruscant for the first time in the pages of a comic was, well, it was less than impressive. I had imagined something much more grandiose when reading Heir to the Empire, though, funny enough, not as grand as it would ultimately turn out to be in The Phantom Menace when we truly got to see it for the first time. Anyway, it turns out Luke's signal is coming from the Imperial Palace, former home of Emperor Palpatine, of course, and while trying to make their way there in the Falcon, Leia takes to one of the gunner chairs, and it's here that it's mentioned that she is the mother of twins, which is and was rather interesting reading it back then, considering they are not born yet in Heir to the Empire. Leia is still pregnant, and they, Jacen and Jaina Solo, won't be born till the 3rd book in the trilogy. And though I found that all very, very cool back in the day to see this level of interconnectivity, it's almost even more impressive in a way to see or realize today just how consistent these 2 stories were with each other. That they even felt so directly connected to each other that I think I could, or should be, forgiven for being confused or believing I was potentially reading a sort of sequel to Heir to the Empire and a prequel to the next book in the series. Either way, and getting back to the story, soon enough our heroes land on Coruscant and we find Lando and some of the other crew members of a crashed Imperial Star Destroyer that had been confiscated and renamed by the Rebellion, and we learn that Luke is not with them. Lando tells Han and Leia that he has sensed the dark side and went off towards the Imperial Palace. Shortly thereafter, while our heroes are kind of pinned down, though Leia is using the Force to try and confuse their enemies, referencing her training with her brother in the process, but Luke Skywalker makes his epic first appearance in these comic books by easily pushing away some necks, which are basically cybernetic dogs, and then he quickly and easily takes down an AT-AT all badass-like, before Leia then sees and senses something is wrong with Luke, and he tells her that, in the Imperial Palace, he has found some strange clues of someone very powerful using the dark side, and that he can now even sense them out there, that they have even touched minds. It's then that a wormhole opens up in space above Coruscant, and from it emerges an energy storm that kind of attacks the planet, but actually is coming after Luke. And he tells Han and Leia that they have to go, especially Leia, because her twins are the future of the Jedi Order. And Han basically tells Leia, we have to trust Luke, and they run off back to the Falcon while Luke gets sucked up into the storm, and through the portal, it seems. And yeah, even back then I found this a little weird, but whatever, I just went with it. And that is then where the first issue ends. And as I was just kind of saying, I remember thinking to myself back then, okay, that was interesting. That was pretty cool, I suppose. I don't know that I remember feeling all that strongly about it either way. I was curious about who this Darksider would be, honestly not expecting or even thinking it would be Palpatine somehow returning. But I was excited for more and would get it a couple months later when the next issue came out. This was a bi-monthly release. And nowadays, rereading it, I think it's not bad for an early 90s comic. I'm also kind of impressed that clearly this comic very much took Heir to the Empire into account, and it fits in pretty much perfectly with it. Almost feels like they did a better job of keeping the canon straight back then than they do today, where comic books are kind of the forgotten or most overlooked or irrelevant part of the new canon. Either way, let's now move on to issue 2 of Dark Empire, which starts out at what's called the Rebels base. There's no talk of a new republic, with the Empire now in control of most of the known galaxy again. And so anyway, we see the Millennium Falcon returning to base after leaving Luke behind on Coruscant and at the mercy of that strange storm. And after a meeting of the rebellion's leaders, we learn that all Imperial ships from both sides of this civil war have disappeared into the uninhabited galactic core, and that the strange storm at Coruscant was not an isolated incident, and more of them are popping up throughout the galaxy, and from them are emerging these giant world-destroying ships. Because it turns out that in secret the Empire was creating a new technology and building a giant fleet of these things at a world that we'd soon learn is like the epitome or culmination of the dark side, and where, Palpatine has been hiding out. We also learn that the civil war between the Imperials may have been nothing more than a distraction to keep the rebels from finding out about what the Imperials were really up to in the galactic core, which all sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like the First Order kind of being a distraction for the New Republic. All the while, on Exegol, Palpatine was hiding out and making a fleet of world-destroying Star Destroyers. In other words, yes, there are plenty of similarities between the Rise of Skywalker and Dark Empire beyond just Palpatine coming back to life. So much so that J.J. Abrams either read the comics at some point and enjoyed them, maybe when he was younger, I don't know, or it is one heck of a coincidence that these stories have so many of the same story beats. Either way, back to the story, one of the planets the Empire is threatening with its world-eating ships, and I call them that because they basically take the raw materials from the planet they're destroying and they build new ships from them right inside the other ships. But anyway, as interesting as that is, one of the planets is Calamari, which we learn was one of the first planets to openly oppose the Empire, and so they're one of the first ones to be destroyed as payback. They were also atop the list of planets that was supposed to be destroyed by the Death Star. However, Lando and Wedge are going to take yet another captured Star Destroyer to try and stop them. Next, we're with Han and Leia, and she's sad about how much time they've spent apart over the years, and since they were married by Mon Mothma, or how much time they've just been fighting wars, but that they have to continue to fight and that they have to go back and help Luke, or so Leia wants to do. But Han's basically like, nah, Luke's a Jedi, he can handle this, and who am I to argue against a Jedi? We then find out that Luke is on a dungeon ship, the same kind that was apparently used to transport Jedi during the Clone Wars, and it's always so interesting to hear Clone Wars references from before the prequels came out. I always try to imagine what they, the writers of the time, imagined the Clone Wars to be before Lucas, of course, gave them to us. As for me, I always used to kind of imagine it was a war where the already long since established Empire used mutant clones to try and destroy the Jedi. But no, that wasn't right, but it sure sounded really cool to me as a kid. Anyway, Luke is taken to a secret planet called Biss, deep in the galactic core, which is that aforementioned dark side planet, not too dissimilar from Exegol. And once there, he is taken down to a luminous city, or so the comic describes it as. He then feels and is drawn to a very powerful dark side presence. He's even essentially let go by his captors at this point, thinking or claiming he is going to it of his own free will, but they, his captors, kind of snicker at him because they feel like Luke doesn't realize he's kind of fallen into a dark side trap here. But using his Jedi intuition, Luke makes his way to a citadel where inside he is not surprised to find Palpatine. He suspected it was going to be him all along, even though I very much remember being rather surprised as a kid reading that. I mean, he had died after all. He'd been tossed down a shaft and had the Death Star blow up on him, so my mind really wasn't going there as a possibility. I just didn't see him coming back. Though reading this again now, yeah, it feels rather obvious it was going to be Palpatine. But either way, Palpatine then says to Luke that somehow I have returned and the issue ends. And I'm of course kidding. This is where he tells Luke that they have both grown more powerful and that what happened on the second Death Star was not the first time he had died, nor would it be the last. Such are the mysteries of the dark side of the Force. He then goes on to tell Luke that flesh does not easily contain or support something or someone as powerful as him, and it causes his body to decay time and time again, and that this is a clone body, which, yes, is again a lot like what we see in The Rise of Skywalker, or what we learn later on in the book, I should say. Furthermore, he tells Luke that dying is painful, that the transition is not an enjoyable experience, but this suffering is a small price to pay for eternal life. And it's great to know the writers, even back then, before the prequels and the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise was known to all of us, that they would realize that the Sith, or Dark Jedi as they were known back then, that they would seek eternal life. It's at this point then that Palpatine asks Luke to take the spot at his side that his father vacated, that it is his destiny to do so, much like he was saying in Return of the Jedi. When Luke is ready to just say no, of course, he's not going to join him. Why would Palpatine think he would? But that's when we learn that Palpatine is going to use the same thing or tactic that tempted Luke's father to the dark side, which is rather interesting to read. But what's not so interesting is I guess it was just power or the opportunity to conquer and destroy that is what turned Anakin to the dark side, because Luke is promised by Palpatine the command of these world devastators if he goes dark side and joins him. And while Luke is mulling it over, Palpatine brags about his master plan, his final order, you could say, and how he has outflanked the rebels and that they mainly lost thanks to not having any Jedi Knights to help them. He then tells Luke that basically it's his destiny to punish the worlds that disobeyed him. And though the comic tells us that Luke is not swayed or tempted by any of this, he's nevertheless still conflicted because he knows if he strikes down Palpatine, he'll just come back again. Palpatine even says he could come back as him, as Luke next time, that I'm assuming he'd just make a clone body of Luke and take that one. Not that anyone would ever clone Luke or something like that. Either way, Palpatine then goes on to tell him that he, Luke, has grown stronger, that he has overcome his anger, and he's not as impulsive anymore, and that if he wants to defeat him, the only way to do so is to embrace the dark side, which you'd really think would sound like a bunch of BS to Luke, but instead he feels like it's the truth, that the dark side speaks true for like the first time ever, and that the only way to defeat Palpatine once and for all is to do it from within, to do it by learning the secrets of the dark side and using them against Palpatine. And so Luke kneels before the Emperor and says, "My father's destiny is now my own." And as a kid reading that, who didn't necessarily give too much thought to any of the deeper meanings of the story of Star Wars, I thought that was pretty cool. I thought, of course, Luke is going to master the dark side and beat it from within because he's Luke frickin' Skywalker. Even if he once did say he'd never turn to the dark side and said it right to Palpatine, whatever. Reading this today, however, though you do have to again keep in mind this came out long before the prequels and before more was known about how the Jedi and the Force truly work, and before I started to really care more about the themes than how cool something was. Anyway, trying to keep all that in mind, it still kind of felt silly that, yeah, in Return of the Jedi, Luke beats Palpatine by embracing the good side of the Force and not fighting, but now it turns out beating Palpatine will kind of require the opposite of him. He has to embrace the dark side and fight. I mean, sure, the writers, probably didn't think that deeply on it back then, and sure, at face value, it does sound, again, maybe kind of intriguing or cool or even badass that Luke has to learn the ways of the dark side to defeat it. It did sound kind of awesome in theory to have Luke master and overcome the dark side from within, but given all we know today, it doesn't make much sense. That's not how the Force works. The idea that you'd have to use the dark side to defeat the dark side sounds like the biggest, most obvious trap ever, and you can certainly argue that's the point. That's why Palpatine is telling him all this, because he knows how it all works and he doesn't think Luke could ever resist the dark side. So in a way, or from that point of view, it does work, I guess. Luke falling for it, though, well, that one I'm not so sure about. Issue 2 of Dark Empire then ends with Leia essentially sensing Luke has fallen to the dark side and hearing some kind of laughter from afar, no doubt Palpatine's hideous chuckle, and Han finally realizing they should go after Luke, and so they do that, and that's how it ends. And again, back in the day, I enjoyed this well enough and was caught off guard by Palpatine's return and Luke willingly going to the dark side to defeat it. And nowadays, I again have to keep in mind how little was known about how all of this worked in the pre-prequel world, and try to enjoy it for what it is, which so far, for the most part, I am enjoying it. It's certainly entertaining, if not exactly accurate to how this should all work. However, we still have 4 more issues for it all to go awry, as well as a couple more parts to the story that come out in the years to follow Dark Empire. But for now, that's all I got for you this time. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed this video and would like me to keep going with this, or maybe not. Or tell me if you've read Dark Empire, and if you maybe read it back in the day, or have read it more recently, and what you think about it. Whatever the case may be though, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.